This game is basically just one long, dirty computer engine line. White Stoofvlees, a very strong and creative engine, creates a magical attack against Igel, offering multiple piece sacrifices for long term compensation. In fact, Igel doesn't understand it's losing until way too late and even thinks that it's winning at some points when it is probably losing. The game opens here with b3, a modern favorite of many, and now e5, bishop b2, knight c6, e3, and d5. Now, those of you not that familiar with computer chess games might not know that it's very common in computer chess games to play from a book and play a position that's often considered balanced but very complex where there's a good chance of decisive games. You basically don't want the engines to play the Berlin all the time. In this game, this is where the book stops. So all of these moves were compelled for the chess engine. They don't necessarily consider them best, but they consider this position interesting. And now here we get bishop b5, the first move selected by an engine. Now we get bishop d6 and f4, trying to rip open the long diagonal here. Of course, you cannot capture because of bishop takes g7 and the rook is trapped in the corner. After f4, black plays pawn to f6, trying to keep a really solid center here, as white tries to bring pressure against that center. And now queen to h5 check, inducing pawn to g6, which softens that long diagonal a little bit. Queen h4, and black captures on f4, e takes f4. Now we get the first sacrificial decision from Stoofvlees in this game. Here, if pawn takes f4, white's certainly not losing, but this is a bit to black's advantage. Queen e7 check, and you're induced here to play knight e2, and the knight's not super happy on e2. Black is better able to utilize the e file, and black seems to be a little bit better, and that little bit matters to chess engines. So instead, Stoofvlees prioritizes development, activity, open lines, and plays knight to f3, a very interesting, probably quite strong move. Both engines basically consider this very complex and pretty unclear at this point. Pretty balanced, but by no means drawn. So here we get f takes e3, which might be a little bit too greedy, but okay. And another pawn sacrifice, castles, determined not to recapture the pawn on e3 if at all possible. Here, if black gets extra greedy and keeps trying to capture pawns, then black basically just loses on the spot. This is a really bad move. And now after knight takes d2 here, black is actually busted. All of white's pieces are developed. White's castled. The rook is coming over here to the e file. And if, for example, bishop d7, you just have rook e1 check, king f7, and c4 is a really strong move. This is going to rip open these lines here, and black's king is just getting slaughtered on all of these diagonals. So after castles, black chooses to develop bishop to d7. White continues to prioritize piece activity, knight c3 here. Knight c to e7, going for an exchange and a release of pressure here along this line. And now white says, okay, it's finally time. I will recapture the pawn. Pawn takes on e3. c6, pushing the bishop back, and the bishop falls back to d3, queen c7, and e4. Rawr, trying to open lines in the middle of the board. White has committed to being a pawn down and wants the maximum open lines so that these well-placed pieces, can bring pressure against the opponent's position. Black castles queenside here. Opposite sides castling is always really, really exciting. In this position, it looks like it might be kind of unclear. Both players could have, chances to attack, but it seems to actually be in white's favor. And I think the reason turns out to be that white has a good way to open lines on the queen side by pushing the A and B pawns up the board, which is what happens in the game. And black's not really in a position to push these pawns very effectively. When you have an opposite sides castling position, pushing pawns to open lines is super critical. And I think this bishop being placed right here and the inability to move the knight on g8 makes it very, very hard for black to advance on the king side. We get pawn takes d5, c takes d5, and now a real computer move. I love this one. King H1. I'm going to go ahead and throw a brilliant on this move, even though I don't completely understand it. I think this move is basically saying, hey, what are you going to do? You don't really have any good moves for black. And by playing King H1, I avoid some checks from the queen or the bishop at some point where, some tactics might not work out for me because of these checks. So I don't necessarily have the best improving moves at my disposal at the moment. You have no good improving moves at your disposal. So I'm just going to play King H1 and ask you what you're going to do. Well, the engine plays pawn to H5, which looks nice. But again, it turns out to be very hard to advance and open lines on the king side. A4, by the way, at this point, Igel is saying that this is -1, that basically Igel thinks it's up a pawn for nothing here, whereas Stoofvlees thinks that it's about equal here and likes its compensation for the pawn. Pawn to A6, trying to take control of the B5 square, which isn't really going to work out. Now, pawn to B4, the queen is defending here on this long rank, so the bishop cannot capture on B4. And in this position, the best move, according to Stoofvlees, was knight to H6, just trying to develop that knight and really improve the coordination of all of the pieces. And it still thinks this is really quite unclear. Instead, black pushes forward with the pawns, pawn G5, gaining a tempo on the queen and playing to win the B4 pawn. But this proves to be way too greedy. Queen back to F2. The queen is pushed away from the defense of the B4 pawn. And we now see Igel capture that, which is very greedy. Igel demonstrates a lot of greediness in this game and is punished for it. Now, how is Igel going to be punished? Well, it is the spectacular move, knight to B5, a brilliant first piece sacrifice. And at this point, Stoofvlees is basically sacrificing the knight just to open the A file. It's not like a human sacrifice where you sacrifice and you just immediately get checkmate or get your material back. It's just saying, hey, I don't need the knight so much, but I do need the open A file, and it may take me 20 moves, but I'm going to make that A file count. After knight b5, Stoofvlees says that this is plus 1.12, so a clear advantage for white. White is bordering on winning in engine parlance. After knight b5, we see pawn takes b5. By the way, Igel thinks it's totally okay and thinks it's better. Pawn takes b5, and now because of the idea of rook up to a8, which would win the queen, b6 is basically forced in this position. Now, rook a6, actually other rook lifts were also good. You basically just want to play to bring the other rook over and invade on the a file successfully. So, rook a6, and now king to b7 here, and bishop to d4, attacking b6, which is a very soft point in the position. Now, in this position, there are two ways that I can really see to defend the b6 pawn. One is knight c8, which is played in the game, and the other is bishop c5, which actually will come up in a moment. Let's see. So, after knight c8, here we see pawn c3. And now the bishop needs to decide where to fall back to. If it goes to c5, we basically get a transposition to if black had played bishop c5 instead of knight c8 a moment ago. Now, after bishop c5 here, this is getting close to like Zugzwang for black in terms of just not being able to release any of the pressure here. And we just play rook fa1, and the idea is to play queen a2, rook up to a8, and then queen into a7, and that's just going to be checkmate. And it turns out that even if this idea is slow, there's really no good way for black to stop this idea. Crushing idea invasion on that a file that we sacrificed the knight to open. So, backing up, after c3, black decides on bishop a5, which also looks very sensible just because we're trying to close the a file and say, hey, you can double rooks, but I've clogged the a file. You're not going to get in. I am doing totally okay. So at this point, Stoofvlees opens more lines. Pawn to c4, trying to get this light square diagonal open, which would be very, very appealing. G4 attacking the knight, and rook takes A5 here. Another brilliant sacrifice. In fact, offering two sacrifices here, the rook for the bishop and leaving the knight hanging on F3. Now, you need to capture the more important piece. Capturing the knight just doesn't work here. In this position, now you move the rook off of A5, and you actually want to make the unintuitive human move and pull the rook all the way back to A1. You know, you'd be thinking, I want to double rooks. Why would I want to pull the rook all the way back? But the key is, in many cases where you're invading on a file, you want to lead with your queen. So you pull the rook all the way back, and now queen A2 is basically just a crushing idea, and there's no way to defend. Capturing on G2 just doesn't change anything. The king is still totally safe, and you still have the basic winning idea. So after rook takes A5, we do see the capture of the rook, and white is now down a rook in this position. And at least to a human, it doesn't look like there are any clearly obvious threats, but black is just not going to be able to defend on the queen side. B6, gaining a tempo on the queen. Queen to D6, C5, gaining another tempo and opening critical lines here to attack. At this point, Stoofvlees is saying this is plus 1.26, a really big advantage for white. And Igel says this is negative 3.07. Black is basically winning. Igel is not correct, evidently. Now, the queen moves over to C6, knight D2, with an idea of knight B3 and knight into A5, which is very scary, which is why black plays the only move that black can really try here, A4. And now probably the prettiest move in the game, knight B3. Beautiful, 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 beautiful move. The knight is sacrificed. The idea of knight A5 means that the knight must be accepted. Black cannot allow the knight to come into A5, but capture of the knight does mean that the A file is open, rook A1. Black is now up a minor piece and a rook, and it just doesn't matter. Black is getting crushed over here on the A file, and the king is just so claustrophobic with all of these pawns around it. Obviously, in this position, bishop A6 is just a devastating idea on the spot. Black needs to give back some material to get some escape squares for the king, so knight to D6. Rook A7 check before capture of the knight, king B8, and now you do capture the knight. White is down. White is back to only being down one rook in this position. Queen C1 check. And I have to admit, if I were playing white, I'd be very concerned about this check. Like in this position, you obviously can't trade queen, so to block the check, you must play bishop F1. And as a human, without the ability to calculate nearly as far as a chess engine, I would be worried about the B pawn, about the back rank, and saying, hey, can I actually make any progress in this position when I'm trying to finish off the attack? But only my rook is really up in the black king's business at this point, and I have all these problems to deal with. Well, the answer is yes, you can continue the attack. Black plays knight to H6, queen to E2, intending queen to A6 when the queen both serves the checkmating ideas and defends the back rank over here. So white's attack is there in time. Queen back to C6, queen to A6 here, which threatens a number of things, including queen A5 and then rook C7, getting the move order right. And ultimately, white is trying to arrange B7 without allowing a queen trade, obviously, and then rook to A8. Black plays B2, looking for counterplay. And I think here's really where Igel is missing the crushing idea in the position, because Igel still thinks it's better until the next move from Stoofvlees, or I think it thinks it's equal at this point. If bishop takes B2, then black has enough time to bring the rook out, activate the rook, and in this position, it's actually very unclear, and the engines both say 0.00. But we don't capture the B2 pawn. Instead, we simply calmly play queen A2. And the idea is simply to play queen takes B2, B7, and then rook A8 checkmate. And that idea turns out to basically be unstoppable. Black is still up a rook, but black is going to have to give up the queen to deal with all of these threats. So this queen a2 move, calmly stopping the b pawn and getting ready to get the queen to the b file by capturing the pawn, is really the decisive idea. So after queen a2, we see b1 queen, and we just capture that, of course. The knight surges back knight f5, attacking the bishop and attacking the pawn, but we don't need to defend the bishop. We have b7, yet another piece sacrifice, but this one trivially cannot be accepted because of knight takes d4, rook a8, checkmate, and this pawn on d6 covers that escape square. So after b7, it's critical not to go after the bishop, but to eliminate that pawn that is controlling the escape square. Knight takes d6, and now rook a6. Basically, the final critical point. It turns out that the black queen is trapped on c6. She has no safe squares. The only square you might look to is queen back to c7, but then the queen is blocking that escape square we were just talking about. So rook a8 is again checkmate. So the only question after rook a6 is, how does black choose to give up the queen? If you try queen takes b7, there's rook to b6. And you might be like, okay, I'm up so much material, I can let your rook capture my queen and I'll be okay. But it's not just going to be the queen that is won. White has such a huge positional advantage that white will have other gains as well. For example, let's say black plays bishop back to c8 to try to hold on to the queen. You pile up with bishop a6, queen takes b6, queen takes, knight back to b7, and bishop e3 is one very nice line. The bishop comes to this diagonal, which cannot be defended. And then you have the idea of bishop takes knight and queen a5. This is just crushing stuff. There's no defense for black. The bishops and the queen work together beautifully. So after rook a6, black gives up the queen with knight takes on b7. And now rook just takes queen, bishop takes, and here black is still up material, right? You've got 2 rooks and 2 pawns for the queen, which is very nice, but another final point, bishop takes f6. And it's clear that white is at least getting back to material equality because of the fork on the rooks in this position. But white is going to get even more than that because white has a huge positional advantage with the safer king, and the bishops are murder on these open diagonals. King c7. Now, you could just capture the exchange here and then try and invade with your queen, and you're close to winning. But your bishop is so strong, you don't need to go after the exchange yet. So you can just keep improving your position. King g1 is now played. Rook h6. Bishop g5, choosing not to take the exchange and instead keep the rooks forked, which is funny. Rook to d6. And now bishop f4. And I find it funny that a moment ago, we had a bishop on f6 forking rooks on d8 and h8, and now we have a bishop on f4, and we've still forked the rooks, and we've added a pin. So we've improved our position because now we've added the pin to our arsenal, just keeping black bound up. Rook e6, queen a1. The queen is going to get in on the queen side, or on the king side. Rook e4, bishop to g3, keeping the pin and not cashing in yet. Rook a4, queen h8. This pawn is falling. King b6, and finally, white has a material advantage in this position. Ultimately here, this position is winning for white because we are going to create a passed h-pawn, and we are just going to win the game. Probably most resilient on a human level is something like rook e4, and white needs to push forward, and white should win with the passed h-pawn. The engines agree, and it's engines playing, so we're going to trust that they know what they're talking about in terms of this. Instead, we see knight c4, which I think is less resilient from a human's perspective because now white gets connected passers, and it's much easier to win. In the Computer Chess Championship, where this game was played, all games are played out till checkmate, but at this point, the game is clearly not in doubt at all. The pawns just surge forward. The queen and king are activated to their maximum, and eventually white picks off all the material and mates in the end with the king and queen in this position. I hope you've enjoyed this game. Incredible chess game. Really fascinating to see the difference in agreement, the difference in assessment of the 2 chess engines, Stoofvlees and Igel, and just wonderful sacrifices all around, with knight b5 opening up the a file, rook takes a5, and ultimately that knight b3. Special stuff. I hope you've enjoyed this game. If you want to see more of these incredible computer chess games, then check out that playlist that is popping up on your screen.